They told you ancient Egypt was a land of gods, gold, and glory. They showed you pyramids, temples, and treasures. But they never told you about the other Egypt, the one carved in secret symbols, whispered through forbidden myths, and hidden in the darkest corners of history. Behind the gold masks and sacred hymns were acts so shocking that even their own neighbors recoiled in disgust. These weren't isolated scandals. They were woven into power, religion, and daily life. Once you see this side of Egypt, you can't unsee it, and it will change how you think of civilization forever. Ancient Egypt is often remembered for its grand monuments, intricate art, and sophisticated religious beliefs. Yet behind this image lies another side of history that is rarely discussed in textbooks. This exploration will focus on sexual practices that have been described in ancient texts, depicted in art, and reported by later historians. The time frame includes the pharaonic period and continues into the Greek and Roman eras when outsiders recorded their impressions of Egyptian life. Our understanding comes from a combination of archaeological finds, inscriptions, papyri, and historical accounts, though it is important to separate what is firmly supported by evidence from what may be rumor, propaganda, or exaggeration. The purpose here is not to sensationalize for its own sake, but to look directly at the practices and beliefs that challenge modern ideas of morality. Some customs were rooted in religious symbolism, others in political strategy, and some appear to have been driven by personal indulgence. By examining both the credible evidence and the more questionable claims, we can understand how sexual behavior was intertwined with power, ritual, and daily life in ways that may seem shocking today. You may think the pyramids are Egypt's greatest legacy, but the reality carved in stone tells a much darker story. Beneath the gold masks and royal ceremonies were acts that blurred the lines between sacred duty and disturbing exploitation. These practices were not always hidden. In some cases, they were openly recorded and celebrated in ways that defy our expectations of ancient culture. One particular custom, whispered about by foreign visitors and hinted at in both myth and historical record, stands out as one of the most unsettling in Egypt's history, a practice involving the dead in ways that few would dare imagine. One of the most disturbing claims about ancient Egypt comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited the country in the 5th century BCE. In his writings, he mentions that the families of beautiful deceased women would sometimes delay sending the body to the embalmers for several days. According to him, this was done to prevent the corpse from being violated during the mummification process. Herodotus presents this as something he was told by local informants, not something he personally witnessed, and he does not provide details about how common the practice might have been. Modern scholars approach this account with caution. Some argue that it could be an exaggeration or even propaganda by Greek writers who wanted to portray Egyptian customs as strange or immoral. Others point out that even if such cases occurred, they may have been rare incidents rather than an accepted part of embalming. However, the fact that Herodotus recorded the claim at all suggests there was at least some cultural awareness or fear of this type of abuse. Such fears would not arise in a society unless the idea had some real precedent, even if it was not widespread. There is no direct archaeological evidence proving that necrophilia was a systematic practice in ancient Egypt. No workshop records, official decrees, or physical remains have been found to confirm it as a routine event. What we do have are scattered historical references and the acknowledgement that ancient Egyptian religion placed complex symbolic value on both death and sexuality, which could, in rare instances, overlap in unsettling ways. But necrophilia wasn't just whispered about. It found its way into Egypt's most sacred myths. One of the most important stories in their religious tradition directly involves sexual contact with a dead body, and it is presented not as a crime or perversion, but as a divine act of creation. This is the myth of Osiris and Isis, a tale that would give spiritual framing to ideas most cultures would never accept. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris was a beloved king and god who was murdered by his jealous brother, Set. Set cut Osiris's body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt. His wife, the goddess Isis, searched tirelessly to find every fragment. When she finally gathered the remains, one part, his phallus, was missing, said to have been eaten by a fish. Isis fashioned a replacement and reassembled Osiris's body. She then used her magic to breathe life into him briefly and conceived their son, Horus, during this union. This story was not told as something shameful. Instead, it was celebrated as a divine act of love and restoration. In the Egyptian worldview, death was not a permanent barrier, and the combination of sexual and funerary themes was presented as a sacred mystery. By linking the conception of one of Egypt's most important gods to intercourse with a reanimated corpse, the myth gave symbolic approval to an act that most cultures would consider an extreme violation. For the elite, such religious narratives could serve as justification for crossing boundaries. If the gods themselves were believed to have acted in ways that ignored the divisions between life and death, then similar acts among mortals could be framed as imitating divine behavior. This was especially relevant in a society where rulers were considered living gods, and religious precedent carried political weight. And if death itself could be sexualized, then the living were no safer from the crossing of boundaries. The same religious logic that blurred the line between life and death would also be used to blur the line between human and animal, leading to accusations and stories of practices that shocked even Egypt's ancient neighbors. Animals played a central role in Egyptian religion, not only as symbols but as living embodiments of the gods. Deities such as Anubis, with the head of a jackal, and Sobek, depicted as a crocodile or crocodile-headed man, represented divine powers tied to death, fertility, and protection. Egyptian art frequently showed gods in hybrid human-animal form, and these images sometimes included sexual symbolism. For example, fertility gods might be portrayed with exaggerated genital features, or mythic stories might allude to unions between gods in animal shapes. These depictions have led to debate about whether the Egyptians practiced ritualized sexual acts with animals, or whether such imagery was purely symbolic. Some modern scholars caution that much of what is claimed about Egyptian bestiality comes from Greek and Roman writers, who often exaggerated foreign customs to portray other cultures as decadent or immoral. A recurring problem is that fertility symbolism, such as animals representing potency or regeneration, can be misinterpreted as literal sexual acts. Nevertheless, a few ancient accounts suggest that some Egyptians may have engaged in ritual behavior involving animals. Greek sources claim that sexual contact with goats, cattle, or other creatures occurred in fertility rites, though no direct Egyptian record confirms this. The most sensational of these allegations concerned the crocodile, an animal both feared and revered. Sobek, the crocodile god, was worshipped in several regions, and living crocodiles were kept in temple pools, adorned with jewelry and given offerings. To outsiders, the combination of sexual symbolism, animal veneration, and temple ritual made it easy to imagine, or invent, shocking practices. But one animal, in particular, gained a reputation for the most feared and fetishized role. Stories spread of rites linked to Sobek that crossed every natural boundary, blending religious devotion with allegations of extreme acts. To understand how such a dangerous creature could be part of these rumors, we have to look closer at the crocodile cults of ancient Egypt. Sobek was one of Egypt's most complex deities, associated with the Nile, fertility, military strength, and royal authority. Depicted with the head of a crocodile, he embodied both life-giving power and deadly force. Temples dedicated to Sobek often maintained live crocodiles in sacred pools, where they were fed, decorated with jewels, and treated as living gods. When these animals died, they were mummified with the same care given to humans, wrapped in linen and buried in special cemeteries. Because Sobek's cult combined fertility symbolism with the veneration of a predator, it became a fertile ground for sensational stories by foreign visitors. Greek and Roman authors, who were often wary or mocking of Egyptian religion, wrote about supposed sexual rites involving crocodiles. These claims have no direct confirmation from Egyptian sources, and modern historians tend to view them as misunderstandings or deliberate slanders. It is likely that symbolic acts, perhaps involving fertility prayers or offerings, were misrepresented as literal sexual encounters to paint Egyptian worship as bizarre or depraved. Such rumors served political purposes. By portraying Egypt as morally corrupt, foreign powers could justify conquest or cultural superiority. In the case of Sobek, His connection to fertility and raw power made the accusations believable to those unfamiliar with Egyptian symbolism. Yet, the real horror didn't always involve animals or corpses. Sometimes it was family. Egypt's ruling class practiced a form of marriage that, while religiously sanctioned, would have devastating genetic consequences and shock the moral standards of most other ancient civilizations. To see how this worked, we need to look inside the royal family itself. In the royal courts of ancient Egypt, marriage between close relatives was not only accepted but often encouraged. The pharaoh was considered a living god, and his queen was frequently portrayed as a goddess. To preserve this divine bloodline, sibling marriage, and in some cases unions between parents and children, was seen as a way to keep the royal family pure in both a political and religious sense. This was framed as an imitation of the gods themselves, many of whom, in Egyptian mythology, were siblings or close relatives. One of the most famous examples comes from Tutankhamun. DNA studies on his mummy, as well as those of related individuals, have revealed that his parents were full siblings. This close genetic relationship likely contributed to the young king's numerous health problems, which included a clubfoot, possible cleft palate, and signs of bone disease. He died in his late teens, and his physical condition suggests that generations of inbreeding had weakened the royal line. Other royal mummies from different dynasties show similar patterns. Skeletal deformities, evidence of hormonal disorders, and other health issues point to the long-term effects of repeated close relative unions. Yet within the cultural and religious context of the time, these marriages were celebrated. They were often depicted in art and inscriptions as harmonious, ideal relationships, reinforcing the image of the pharaoh and queen as divine partners. While these practices were largely limited to the royal family, their influence on cultural attitudes toward marriage and sexuality was significant. By presenting incest as a sacred duty, the palace set a precedent for bending moral norms in the name of religion. But the palace was only the beginning. Temples, too, rewrote morality in their own image, creating systems where sexual acts were tied directly to worship and profit. To see this in action, we must examine the institution of sacred prostitution. Unlike Babylon, where sacred prostitution is better documented, ancient Egypt leaves no definitive written law or decree confirming the practice. However, some suggestive records and outsider accounts point to the possibility that certain temple activities blurred the line between religious ritual and sexual commerce. In these accounts, sexual services were offered within temple precincts and framed as acts of devotion to the gods. Participants might believe that by engaging in intimacy within a sacred space, they were granting pleasure to the deity and securing divine favor for themselves or their families. The priesthood, which controlled the temples, would have been in a position to regulate and benefit from such activities. Temples were not just places of worship. They were economic powerhouses, owning land, collecting taxes, and running craft workshops. If sexual services were part of the temple's offerings, they could be another source of income, either through direct payment or through gifts and offerings made by worshippers seeking blessings. Even if the practice was not widespread or officially sanctioned, the mere suggestion of it in ancient writings indicates that sexualized religious interactions were plausible within the Egyptian worldview, especially given their rich mythology of gods with human desires. Because much of the evidence comes from foreign observers, there is a risk of exaggeration or deliberate distortion. Still, the idea that sexual acts could be sanctified through religion aligns with other examples of boundary-crossing behavior in Egyptian tradition. And in the temple's shadow, the most vulnerable suffered in silence. For if sexual contact could be justified as worship for paying adults, it could also be imposed on those with no power to refuse. In some accounts, this extended to the dedication of children to temple service, raising disturbing questions about how far exploitation could reach within sacred walls. Some ancient accounts describe a practice in which children were dedicated to temples at a young age, often as part of a vow made by their parents. In the most positive interpretation, these children might have served as singers, dancers, or attendants in religious ceremonies, receiving food, shelter, and basic education in return for their service. However, other reports, mostly from later or foreign sources, allege that such dedication could lead to more troubling forms of exploitation. These narratives suggest that children, once under the control of the temple, could be groomed into roles that extended far beyond ceremonial duties, including forms of sexual servitude. The reliability of these claims is debated. Archaeological evidence for organized, large-scale sexual exploitation of children in Egyptian temples is lacking. Much of the sensational detail comes from outsiders, especially Greek and Roman writers, who had political and cultural incentives to portray Egyptian religion as corrupt. Modern scholars caution against taking these accounts at face value without corroborating evidence. Still, the idea of sacred dedication created a structure where, if abuse did occur, it could be hidden behind the authority of religion and the power of the priesthood. In such a system, children could spend their entire lives within temple walls, never returning to their families. Over time, they might come to see their position not as forced but as divinely ordained, a mindset that would make resistance unlikely. The combination of religious authority, isolation from outside influences, and lifelong dependency created an environment where exploitation, if it happened, could continue unchecked. But what happens when myth, power, and exploitation become one? The answer lies not just in isolated incidents but in the way these ideas and practices could become accepted parts of social life, shaping norms far beyond the temple gates. This leads to the question of cultural normalization. When taboos are repeatedly broken by society's most powerful figures, they can slowly lose their stigma among the wider population. In Egypt, royal sibling marriage is a clear example. While this practice was originally confined to the pharaohs and justified as a divine duty, evidence from the later Roman period in Egypt shows that some ordinary families also married brothers and sisters. These unions may have been motivated by inheritance concerns or local tradition, but the royal example had already normalized the idea that such relationships could be acceptable. Religious myths and temple art also played a role in softening public reactions to taboo subjects. Stories of gods engaging in acts that blurred moral boundaries, whether between life and death, human and animal, or within the family, were widely known. Visual depictions of sexual scenes, even if symbolic, were present in certain papyri, ostraca, and temple reliefs. Over generations, such images could make even extreme acts feel like part of the natural order. This created a feedback loop. Elite practices shaped religious narratives shaped public tolerance, and public tolerance allowed certain behaviors to persist or at least remain unchallenged. The result was a culture in which boundaries we see as absolute were far more flexible, especially when framed as part of sacred tradition. And the Egyptians made sure none of this would be forgotten. They recorded aspects of sexuality in ways that, centuries later, would shock and puzzle those who uncovered them. To understand the scope of what was preserved, we need to look closely at the surviving documentation, from erotic papyri to censored museum collections. Some of the most striking evidence for sexual themes in ancient Egypt comes from its surviving art and manuscripts. The Turin erotic papyrus, dating to around 1150 BCE, is perhaps the most famous example. Discovered in the 19th century, it depicts a series of explicit scenes alongside humorous illustrations, suggesting it may have been intended as satire or entertainment rather than as a literal record of behavior. Erotic ostraca, small pottery fragments with sexual drawings, have also been found, often near workers' villages like Deir el-Medina, indicating that sexual imagery circulated outside elite contexts. In tomb art, sexual symbolism could appear in more stylized form, often linked to fertility or rebirth. When these artifacts were first examined in Europe during the Victorian era, they caused considerable discomfort. Scholars and museum curators sometimes withheld them from public view, fearing they would offend contemporary moral standards. In some cases, access was restricted to a small number of approved researchers, and detailed descriptions were omitted from official catalogues. This censorship meant that for decades, the sexual dimension of Egyptian culture was underrepresented in popular histories. Selective preservation has also shaped our understanding. Organic materials like papyrus survive only in rare conditions, so what we have is fragmentary. The most provocative items, such as the Turin papyrus, may give a skewed impression simply because they are unusual enough to survive and capture attention. Without the broader context of ordinary depictions, it is difficult to judge how common or exceptional these sexual images were. But even with censored fragments, the bigger question remains. How much of what we think we know about Egyptian sexuality reflects historical reality, and how much has been amplified by the biases of later observers? To answer that, we must weigh the evidence against interpretation, which leads to the final analysis. Modern understanding of ancient Egyptian sexuality is shaped by a mix of archaeology, ancient writings, and centuries of interpretation. One of the biggest challenges is separating propaganda from fact. Greek and Roman authors, who are some of our main outside sources, often portrayed Egypt as exotic and morally lax. These portrayals could be politically motivated, designed to justify conquest or to present their own cultures as superior. As a result, practices like necrophilia, bestiality, or large-scale temple prostitution may have been exaggerated or even invented to shock readers. Even when based on real customs, outsider accounts can distort meaning. Fertility rituals or symbolic imagery might be described as literal sexual acts. Similarly, myths that blend human and divine behavior may be retold as evidence of actual practice. This bias becomes even harder to untangle when such stories are repeated over centuries, gaining authority simply by being retold. In the modern era, sensational claims often find a ready audience. Media, online videos, and popular books sometimes present the most extreme allegations as established fact, focusing on shock value rather than careful analysis. Images like those from the Turin erotic papyrus are circulated without context, encouraging viewers to see them as proof of widespread practices rather than as isolated or symbolic works. Presenting this history responsibly requires acknowledging both the credible evidence and the uncertainty around it. It also means recognizing that the most disturbing claims may tell us more about the prejudices of their recorders than about Egypt itself. Without this caution, we risk replacing ancient myth with modern myth-making, which leaves us with the uncomfortable truth. The story of Egyptian sexuality is not simply one of verified horrors or harmless symbolism, but a complicated mix of both. To see the full picture, we must confront what the evidence truly shows, and what it doesn't, before delivering a final verdict. The sexual history of ancient Egypt sits at the intersection of evidence, myth, and interpretation. Some practices, like royal sibling marriage, are confirmed by both written records and modern DNA analysis. These unions were driven by political theology, aiming to preserve a divine bloodline. Other claims, such as necrophilia among embalmers, ritualized bestiality, and organized temple prostitution, remain unproven, existing mainly in outsider accounts and colored by the prejudices of the time. Myths like that of Osiris and Isis reveal how religion could normalize ideas that, in other contexts, would be deeply taboo. What emerges from this mix is a portrait of a society where sexuality was not a private matter but a tool of power. In the palace, it reinforced political legitimacy. In temples, it could be tied to economic and ritual authority. Even when certain acts were symbolic, the stories and images surrounding them influenced how people thought about boundaries between sacred and profane, life and death, human and divine. The grandeur of ancient Egypt, its monuments, art, and cultural achievements, existed alongside these darker narratives. Whether every claim is historically accurate or not, the fact that such stories were told, recorded, and sometimes celebrated speaks to a civilization where sexuality was deeply embedded in expressions of control, identity, and belief. The stones still stand, but the shadows between them tell another story.